Hello and welcome back to the Double Clutch podcast. I'm one of your usual hosts, Mike Miller. If you're not already, please make sure you subscribe to the podcast and are following us on all social media platforms at Double Clutch UK. As you can see today, I have a very special guest with me, and here's where I wish I could do like a Ray Clay impression or something like that. But joining me for the third time, a three-peat, if you will, it's the author of Blood on the Horns, Michael Jordan, The Life, and Showboat, The Life of Kobe Bryant. It's esteemed author Roland Lazenby. Roland, welcome back. How are you doing?
I'm well, and thank you for that introduction. It is appreciated, and always a joy to visit with you over basketball.
Oh, yeah. Well, this is like I say, the third time we've done it now. I think the first time must have been, we definitely did one around Kobe's retirement, and that was the second one. And I think
I
must have
know
been with the
we
book.
visited when I came to the UK for the
Yeah,
Sports Book Awards.
yeah. And I think because
That
that,
was in 2017.
wow. Okay, time flies.
Yeah.
Time flies. So you've had a hectic schedule, obviously. In addition to writing a Magic Johnson book, with everything going on in well, I say with everything going on in the NBA, there's nothing going on in the NBA right now, but we have been blessed with the Last Dance, which has taken decades to come out essentially, but has captivated audiences around the globe for the past 5 weeks, dropping double episodes every Sunday. We had episode 10 come out this Sunday or Monday in the UK. Let's jump straight in there. What were your thoughts on the documentary? Was it an accurate portrayal of the events that happened? Because, of course, you were there as it unfolded.
It was. I was really impressed. I enjoyed it a lot. You'll enjoy episodes 9 and 10. I think they really bring the whole thing home. And this is Michael's story. He waited years before he approved the releasing of the video that was shot in 97, 98, shot by Andy Thompson, Klay Thompson's uncle.
Mm-hmm.
And, Jason Hare, the director, really did a wonderful job. It's a huge amount of information to push through, but one of the things that he did was so good. He got Jordan to agree to show in raw ways the bastard who drove it all. And there's probably not another better way to describe it. I've already been through ferocious and bully, and it really is that portrait. When Blood on the Horns came out in 1998, right after that season, Jeff Van Gundy, who was coaching the Knicks at the time, bought 15 copies and gave them to his players and said, this is what you have to do to win a title. As if anybody could copy that maniacal, in-your-face approach that only a supreme figure like Michael Jordan could do. You couldn't take some average or even good NBA player and treat everyone like that and get away with it. Only a guy who is at that level in every way, athletically, with his own effort, with the adulation, with the fact that everybody was getting paid because of him. He had the whole situation by the throat, and he was shaking it like a rag doll. And he shook 6 championships out of the circumstances. He refurbished Chicago. He made the NBA a global fascination. And here we are all these years later, still fascinated.
Well, that's one of the big things, really, is the impact he had globally. Because without him, perhaps this conversation isn't taking place. It more than likely isn't, because he's how I got into the game, and obviously your books are about him. I found it really interesting, having grown up watching the NBA entertainment documentaries that were released in the 90s. So, Come Fly With Me. I can't even remember the names of them. They're sat behind me on the shelf there alongside many other.
Right.
But
I know. I have them all.
But they were so marketed to the degree where, he's the smiling sales guy, the face of the NBA, things like that. Whereas here we actually got to see him, cursing a lot more. And at first it was a little bit, okay, we've heard about him cursing in the books, but we've not seen it really. And here we had him, ripping on other players. There was the interaction with Larry Bird in episode 9, I think it was, right at the end, where as they embrace following Bulls Game 7 win. And it was great to see that side of it. And then at the other sort of end of the spectrum, we got to see sort of the emotions that were built up in MJ about how much winning just consumed him. I think it was the end of episode 7, I want to say, where he calls cut or break to try and stop the interview. And we just kind of got a much wider spectrum of Jordan as a person, it felt like, certainly on tape. But you're sort of saying that's kind of like what he was like in '98 when you were there.
Yes. No, I got hired in 1993 by the Chicago Tribune book division to write the history of the Bulls. And that sort of started me on this run and I was doing interviews with everyone. And one of my early interviews with Phil Jackson, he said, and Michael wasn't with them when I was doing this interview. He later returned, but he said, it's just incredible to have Michael Jordan on your team. You go into these arenas and he's going to do everything that you could imagine to win a game. And you're usually going to come out of there victorious and you're going to be dominant. And the feelings in and around those games are incredible. And then he said, the hard part is in between, when that personality never turns off. And, it's abrasive and it really requires some moderating just to deal with it. And so slowly over time, while I was doing that work, I began to see more and hear more. And even then, people in that tight group were reluctant. He was the payday, and they were all terrified of him. And that my point in Blood on the Horns is that he drove the entire Bulls franchise. They were all stepping to his tune and really responding to his anger. And of course, when he came back, his father had been murdered. He had all this residual anger that was playing out behind the scenes with the legal things, with his father's murder, and all of what had been Michael was heightened, but especially the anger in a lot of ways. And he became harsher. Now, he had more and more tools to deal with that because of the meditation and the things that George Mumford, the team psychologist and the Zen practitioner on the staff, had done with him. And Jordan had a great appreciation for those things. But what we saw a lot of in The Last Dance, I think you have to consider that his real personality hypercharged by the murder of his father. It's not something you're going to get over in a short time. It goes on. It carries with you.
Well, that led to one of the most poignant moments in the documentary. Is obviously after the return, they go to the finals in '96. And they win on Father's Day. And of course, we've seen the iconic photos before, but hearing him, for want of a better word, just sob whilst, in the locker room, that was really sort of an emotive point and just underscored obviously there's the fact that it lined up on Father's Day is just, more than coincidence. It's just unreal the way that unfolded. But just to come back and do this, having gone through that and having carried that with him, given that his father was essentially his best friend, it's just just seeing that scene was emotional for the viewers as well.
It was jarring at the time. Nobody knew how angry he was. Nobody knew how emotional he was. All the sports reporters there were sort of operating by an unwritten code. You don't use a media session to ask Jordan questions about his father's murder.
Mm-hmm.
You don't come in and gouge his emotions. And so it was unrealistic. We had Jordan commenting and talking to us every day. And it was as if everything was just fine and there wasn't all this stuff playing out in his life. And, I was a crime reporter before I became a sports writer. And I used to I was the night police reporter covering all the mayhem in the city in Virginia where I live. And then I became the reporter covering the court system and just the difficulty of covering murder trials. And then I had a very close family friend whose son was murdered. And I watched, and I was part of the emotion of that. And, nobody in Chicago, I think, had that sense of just how emotional Michael Jordan was through all of that. And when Father's Day came, and the marketing of Michael Jordan contributed to that. He was the guy who did all of this and be like Mike Gatorade and Nike and whatever they could market with him. He was all of that. And he was driving those products even as this happened. But that's the reason to do the larger books that I do. You want to pull in, because there's often two narratives. It's just like with Kobe Bryant. He went into the playoffs having thrown his parents out of his life. He surgically removed them, and for all intents and purposes, they never reconcile. That was, and so, but he's there playing in the playoffs in 2001, and they beat Philadelphia in his hometown of Philadelphia, and he has no family there. And his teammates are celebrating, and he's over in a handicapped stall in the locker room sobbing. And because he had used mindfulness again to hold all of that emotion at bay. And when they finally won, it just flooded over him. And so, we tend not to understand, because they do seem like they're at least a version of a superhero. And we tend not to think, wow, this is raw and real. They are real people, often going through very harsh things.
Yeah, I think that's, like you say, it's the superhero complex we give them. We make them seem to be bigger than human and something that's unattainable. That's the Blood on the Horns book. How did that come to be? What was the impetus behind that? Obviously, in '97, the comments are made after they win the title about not bringing it back together. So was it at that point we went, hold on, this is it. I need to write this. How did you sort of get into this is the book that's happening?
Well, I had gotten very close with Tex Winter, and I knew that, and he kind of guided me through that book, because he was close with Krause, close with Phil. He was sort of the glue guy who was holding all of this together. And I had done that Bulls history in '95, and then this publisher out of Kansas City hired me to go with the team for the '95-'96 season when they won 72 games. And that book was a book called Bull Run, and it was a combination. It wasn't a full-length book. It had wonderful photos from Bill Smith, the Bulls team photographer. But that book was very successful commercially, and it won the Sports Book of the Year from the Independent Publishers Association. The next year, I worked with another publisher to do the Bulls Championship book. But then that Kansas City publisher came back and said, this looks like it's going to be the final season. Let's do something. And so the quote, Blood on the Horns, actually comes from Dick Klein, who founded the Bulls and wanted a logo. And so he commissioned a logo, and he said, I wanted a mean-looking bull with red eyes and all this stuff, and blood on the horns. And of course, that is the logo, but it's also Michael Jordan. Mm-hmm. And also that season where everybody got gored. And so the quote is on the back cover of the book. It is, I wanted the bull to be a true bull in a bull fight. You know, he's big and black. He's a big and black thing with long horns and red eyes and mean. I wanted a mean-looking bull. Most of the early submissions were full bodies, the bull with his head down, that sort of thing. I said, I want a face. Give me a face. And they gave me a face that looked real good. Now I said, all we have to do is make his eyes red. And I want blood on his nose or red nostrils and blood on his horns. And so there was blood on the horns, and there's Jordan, and he's got that fierceness. Not only was it his countenance, it was his reality through and through.
So when you follow a team then through a season, how close are you? Are you there almost every day? Are you traveling? By this point, are you still are members of the media still traveling with the teams, or is it they travel separately, but you're following them from city to city?
Yeah, they would travel separately and follow from city to city. I was still teaching college 2 days a week.
Wow.
In Virginia, and so I would go to Chicago on weekends. I was teaching Tuesday and Thursday, and I could leave Thursday night or early Friday morning, be in Chicago, come back Monday night, teach my 2 days of classes, and get right back at it. And it was quite a pace for that thing. There's a large media contingency covering the Bulls at that time, larger than I'd ever encountered. You know, there were more and more foreign journalists involved, camera crews everywhere. It was not old home week, but by then I had spent 4 years there. Again, I was very close with Tex Winter, and we would discuss what the issues were. Then I would get, I would look where I could get maybe a couple of minutes with Jordan and just one question, and enough to sort of make him stop and look at me like, how did you know that? For example, I was in Toronto with the team, and I noticed somewhat often Pippen would come out of the shower first, and all the media would go there. And then Jordan would come in. They were all moths to a flame to Pippen, and they wouldn't often see him. And in Toronto, I timed it perfectly. Pippen came out, and the locker room was packed, and they all went whoosh right over to Pippen. And then here comes Jordan, and I step up beside him and ask him one of those questions as we walk across the room. And I couldn't ask those questions in front of the media group because I would be giving away all of this story that I was working on. And that led eventually to, more time here, 20 minutes in Charlotte, another 20 in Dallas, then an hour alone outside of practice, time to sit down. And it was a gradual thing. And armed with the knowledge of certain things going on that other people would tell me, um, I was then able to, the star players get a lot of media attention, but a lot of the role players would basically be sitting at their lockers.
Mhm.
That's true in a lot of NBA locker rooms, especially back then when players tended to spend more time in the locker rooms. And so then I could go to a Ron Harper or a Luke Longley or a Steve Kerr and just sort of go over what I was working on and get their response. And over time, and then ultimately, Phil Jackson would give me time, and he was telling me all these things and all these recorded on the record interviews that were just devastating to Jerry Krause. And so I later showed them to Krause and Reinsdorf, and they came back furiously with information that was devastating in a lot of ways to Phil Jackson.
So you played them off against each other to a degree.
Well, I had to let each one know.
Of course.
And part of it was fascinating as a journalist, and an awful lot of it was just very sad.
Okay.
Because part of me, obviously, there's a fan there too. And, at the end of the series, Jordan started talking about getting everybody together in a room to talk it out. Well, I posed that question to him that spring. I said, why can't we get everybody in a room and you guys just talk it out? And he was not into that at all. He said, if you expect me to sit down with Jerry Krause after all the things he's done, we've played through this stuff and we've competed, and the things he's done to undermine this team, I'm not going to do it. And so I did think that was humorous that Jordan would come back now and suggest that, when at the time he wanted no part of it when I suggested it to him. They were all very angry. Phil used that anger, I should add. Phil Jackson, the coach, he used that anger against Krause to drive the focus of that team. And that team sorely needed it. Team was struggling down the stretch, as we saw.
Yeah, Krause is one of the interesting parts of this, because obviously he's sadly no longer around to defend himself. And the way the documentary started was very much, we were sort of exposed to elements of the I guess the grating relationship between Jordan and Pippen and Krause, where we would see the sort of the comments and the chides and things like that. And obviously we know the nickname Crumbs and things like that. Do you think Krause, I'm guessing it's going to be a yes, but Krause must have had a different view of this? There's more than one truth out there. There's Michael's story, there's the truth, and then there's probably Jerry's story as well.
I'm writing this book on Magic Johnson, and some a film producer contacted me. Of course, I have hundreds and hundreds of interview tapes over 35 years of NBA conversations with stars and all kinds of people in the NBA. And, and it got me to thinking about my Magic book, and we dragged out boxes of tapes, and I started looking at I was looking at 90-91 for some Lakers stuff. And the Lakers in March 1991 were playing in Washington, D.C. And back then, the Wizards were named the Bullets. And so I had gone up there. Magic was making his way to breaking the assist record of Oscar Robertson. And it was about 6 weeks out, but I wanted to get up there and get some conversation time in with him. And I was lucky. I was able to get, and I had forgotten I had this conversation with Magic. And so that part of it was exciting, but I had forgotten that Jerry Krause had shown up at that game. He used to be a scout for the old Baltimore Bullets, which was the same franchise. And he was very close with the Bullets owner. He had been a scout for the Lakers, and he was very close with the Lakers people. And he had, in the spring of 91, his vision had come together. And everything that he wanted Tex Winter's triangle. He wanted Phil Jackson as the coach. He had drafted Pippen and Horace Grant, and he had assembled these players. And they were looking like that team. And he had showed up there, wasn't really to gloat. He was just, this was sort of old home week for him. He had suffered a lot. He'd been the GM of the Bulls for about 3 months in the 70s and was fired. And it had been humiliating for him. And now he's back. He's built this team. They're playing well. So he was there in the hallway, just hanging outside the locker room for the media people coming out. And I didn't know him then. I would get to know him very well, but I stopped and did this interview with him about the Bulls. And he was so happy. He was so proud. His vision was there. He was the little fat guy who had been the backup catcher on the baseball team, would never get into the game. And yet he had managed to conquer this world of athletics. And, listening to that made me think, what a contrast. In 2012, 2013, I had interviewed Jerry a lot during the 90s after that. But I obviously went back to revisit it with Michael Jordan, The Life, the big biography I was writing. And Krause was so bitter. And he was angry, and he said, he was resolute and resigned to all of it, but he said, I have videotapes of all of our games and all of our championships and all of the great stuff. And I've never watched a minute of it. And I just thought, how sad. I was thinking that when he told me that at the time. When I went back and I heard his voice in Washington when it was all beginning, I went, wow. The bloody path to those 6 championships, that shows the bookends of that and what that meant. And I think that Jerry Krause suffered for that tremendously. Now, he was a bully. Jerry Krause was a bully, and Michael Jordan was a bully. And the thing that is in Blood on the Horns that is not in the documentary is what I consider the supreme moment. It was the 97 playoffs in Utah in the finals. And Jerry always insisted on riding on the team bus, and that just, Phil tried to get him not to do it. It was an old baseball thing but Krause was going to go wherever he wanted, and the players didn't want him around. And Krause had a way of infuriating Jordan. And Krause had played a pretty good role in the drafting of Earl the Pearl Monroe for the Baltimore Bullets. And he always, in the early days, loved to tell Michael that Earl the Pearl was better. And what we know of Jordan, how that just, that they would have unpleasant exchanges. Mm-hmm. This is really childish stuff to the rest of us, but to these 2 bullies. And but Jordan on that team bus had a couple of beers, smoking cigars. They were coming after Utah pretty good, and he would just start in on Krause with all of this stuff. taunting him and belittling him and making fun of him in front of the whole team. And the players were howling, but Luke Longley and Winnington and those guys, they were always careful not to laugh too loud because Michael would start in on them viciously. And everybody got real uncomfortable with it, but Michael way overdid it. And that summer of 97, and Phil Jackson had to sit there. He was sort of helpless to stop it all. And that summer is when Krause was determined to trade Pippen and to fire Phil Jackson, summer of 97. And Reinsdorf had to step in and stop him. But that had been the final sort of meltdown ugliness that really was not in The Last Dance, that really drove a lot of this final anger. He's not coming back even if we go 82-0. And Jordan throws in, it was The Last Dance. Phil ultimately at the end, they had sort of won. Reinsdorf was going to make concessions. They're going to bring Phil back. They didn't want to do all this. They were still fudging it. They were worried about they had made hundreds of millions of dollars on the Bulls, but they were worried about putting an investment into Pippen. They were worried about Rodman. They were getting him for a dance, but they needed cover. Reinsdorf did, and Krause's battle provided them cover. And they sort of made an offer to Phil, and they did, you can come back, but they really didn't step up and solve it. And so Jordan had gone all in to keep Phil, and Phil just walked away. And it was The Last Dance, but Jordan was left on the dance floor without anybody to dance with. And that was the saddest part of this. But Jerry Krause had told me in 2012 and 13, amidst all his bitterness, that as the team broke up, and this is not in The Last Dance, that he had called Michael in to his office for one final meeting. And in that meeting, Krause said, Michael, I would always tell you that Earl the Pearl was better. And this is Krause's arrogance too. He said, I was lying. I didn't think it. I thought you were better, but I didn't think I should tell you. And Michael was like, I knew it. It was not a.
It's almost like he knew exactly which nerve to hit to just drive him. But it's backfired, essentially, the monster he created to a degree.
I don't think Krause was so impulsive, and he was so needy. And one of the things that Phil went into and on the record for Blood on the Horns, that the last thing Michael liked to do before he took the floor was go back and by himself in the locker room, sit on the John. And Jerry so many times would pick that moment to go back there and sit on the John while Michael was back there. I mean, this is ridiculous stuff. And it would just infuriate Michael. But it was almost like Jerry had this need for intimacy, trying to be one of the guys. Jerry did not have that ability. When he was a scout, he was the sleuth. He was this funny little fat man in a hat and an overcoat going around scouting players, and was just paranoid. And he could have been a cartoon character. And so it was an odd pairing that produced amazing things. By no means do I want to suggest that because Krause made this mistake, this hubris, as it was called. Krause thought it was about him. He had that arrogance, that cockiness. It wasn't about any one of them except for Michael Jordan. And we saw that, and it goes to the Kobe stuff. You saw that organic ferocity of Jordan. You know, did I mention to you Jeff Van Gundy buying Blood on the Horns?
Yeah.
And Jordan, that organic, you can't copy that. Now, Kobe had his own thing, but he wasn't copying Jordan. That was Kobe's own thing. Adidas, when Kobe was a 15-year-old kid, discovered him and let it be known they wanted, with Sonny Vaccaro, they wanted to make him the next Jordan. Just the suggestiveness of that had Kobe shaving his head and doing the kinds of things teenagers would do if you tell them those things. But the organic Kobe, the one who was getting his high school teammates up at 5 a.m. because regular practice wasn't enough, the guy who was berserk in his own pursuit, that's not a code you copy. That's who Kobe was. He just happened to have Michael Jordan sort of lighting the path for him there a bit.
Yeah, it's really interesting, some of the stories you've sort of brought up there. Obviously, the moment on the bus, things like that, potentially were captured by the NBA entertainment crew.
I don't. They were not on that bus. Now,
they weren't on that bus.
You saw Krause. There was a
because there was the Pippen Krause moment that almost they didn't air, but they almost
that was
did.
in 1990, and you heard about that tape. It was out floating around.
Okay,
there was not a lot of internet, but you heard there was. I mean, it was like the internet was nothing then, but you heard about this videotape. Once they beat the Pistons, they got on that plane and here comes Krause doing his little fat man dance. And it was just this bizarre moment. And they all, sort of just went, get out of here, Jerry. You saw but that was not the NBA crew. That was somebody else. That was not Andy Thompson. That was the spring of 91. That was later that spring after I talked to him, and he was so proud and happy, and they swept the Pistons, and he got on the plane and was, he tried to be one of the players doing his Batman worm or whatever it was. I don't know. But it was ridiculous. And yes, Michael Jordan shouldn't have abused him. But Krause was this needy guy who wanted to be one of the guys. And he couldn't be general manager in that too. He couldn't be the sleuth sneaking around. Everybody on that bus lives their life, and Krause is there gathering information on them. And these are NBA players. They are living the NBA life. It was extremely uncomfortable, but he would never listen to Phil and stay away. And all of that dynamic led to all of this.
So the NBA entertainment team, they filmed about 500 hours of footage, as I understand it.
Yeah, they got a couple hours of me in there somewhere that never made the light of day, but Andy did interviews with me back in the day.
Do you think some of that footage will, be made available at any point? And that, there's also stories of a DVD being circulated previously, roughly, I think it was about 10 years ago or so, of an initial idea for this, which had footage. Did you ever see that?
I did not. I wasn't privy to that. That was a DVD put together as a pitch. And so they knew they were going to have to get a bunch of money to do it. And so they had to get the network executives drooling. And so, it's amazing. Jordan told me in 2008, I was talking about it with him about his life at the pre-draft camp. We were sitting alone up in the high seats in Orlando, and he said timing is everything. And of course his life was all this perfect timing. And this is another example of that. He waits 20 some years to agree to the release of this. And when does it happen? During COVID-19, when we're all prisoners. We're all on house arrest. We can't go anywhere. There's no sports programming on TV. And the only thing on is his documentary that has the global audience going bonkers.
Yeah. The ESPN ratings from it have been phenomenal. 5-6 million.
That doesn't even include all the Netflix and all the other stuff added.
That pushes it up to sort of 16 million or so. So we'll go through some quick questions then because I don't want to take up too much of your time.
I've got a couple more to do, so that helps.
Okay, so I saw on Facebook the other day that Jason, the director, had essentially referred to Michael Jordan, the life, as the MJ Bible, which is a huge compliment, massive compliment.
And he said Blood on the Horn was required reading for his staff.
Mm-hmm.
That was unprompted. It was very generous of him.
What piqued my interest, though, was someone commented that you should have been a consultant, and you replied saying MJ, something along the lines of MJ would never have allowed it. Can you elaborate on that at all?
Of course, I had a very difficult decision to make in writing the MJ book. I was aware of his sister's allegations about Michael's father. I was aware she had written a book on it. I had seen the book. And I was trying to tell the story. And I didn't know what to do. And I went to UNC. I was doing research. I hadn't made up my mind what I was going to do. But I went down there, and her book was on special collections in the UNC library. And so it was sort of, I said, well, you're writing a biography. Are you going to overlook? And I was determined, one, not to hype it. And you don't even know about it till boom. There's a little 1.5 page, 2-page section on it, and it's over. I don't know if it's true or not. I just said the allegation alone was enough to just eviscerate a family. Not only that, but an allegation that she repeated throughout 40 years until she was a grandmother, and then wrote a book about it when she was a grandmother. And so I said, there's no way. It was not adjudicated. There were no formal charges filed. Who knows? That pretty much ended my decision to go ahead and include that information. Pretty much. Now, MJ, after the book came out, the media people at the Charlotte, at his team, treated me with such kindness and actually privilege. And he shook my hand briefly. It was awkward, but he shook my hand. I had come to him and told him before I started the book that I was doing it, and we had talked briefly about his great-grandfather.
Mm-hmm.
But they had elected, they wanted, if something was going to be done, we were going to have to discuss a financial arrangement. And part of it is this too, that he was not financially involved.
Mm-hmm.
You know, all of the books that he had done, he didn't willfully cooperate with anyone unless he was financially involved. And that's not a biography. That's, an independent project. And I wanted to do an independent project. And so apparently the feelings are hard there. I don't know. They haven't expressed that to me, but there have been offers to do documentary stuff with Michael Jordan life. And I hold the book rights to that, but this is Michael Jordan's life. And in the film industry, he has the life rights, and they've declined any film company that has approached them about Michael Jordan life. And so I was surprised that Jason Hare went out of his way to publicly acknowledge my work and how important it had been to them. I don't think that probably brought a celebration in corporate uh, the corporate offices of the Jordan operation. But that's I had an interviewer ask me about that recently, and I said, "Gosh, that was a tough decision at the time. It's still tough, but I always approached as I got going with these books. My goal was to sort of try to give all the people, all the fan base, the information they needed to understand. And it's a very difficult story. And so I didn't take that story lightly in the book. I don't bring it up in interviews.
Mm-hmm.
I don't duck it. But when someone asks, I respond. And, it is what it is. Every person has to decide, and I'll never really know. It is something I still go back and forth on to this day.
No, I know exactly which bit you're talking about in the book. It was a shock to read when I first read it in 2014, but I guess that's your journalistic integrity, essentially, is to include it, and that's one of the reasons that perhaps things like The Last Dance have had slight criticism, is because he's involved and therefore it's not objective enough.
Well, this is Michael Jordan's video version of his story.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, and I don't say that, I think it's amazing what Jason Hare got him to agree to.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Michael has allowed this documentary to be forthcoming. It doesn't have everything, but they don't have time to do everything.
I wish they did.
Exhaustive. And I don't think Michael wants to drag that out.
Mm-hmm.
I don't blame him. I don't know. At the time I said, this explains a lot about all the conflict in the family. And it was laid out in detail. But I also have to respect his sister.
Sure.
And she went to the trouble to write a book about it, independently published. And I just didn't feel I could write this. And it's a detailed family story. It's not as if I just glossed over everything.
No, you take it right back to slavery, essentially, in the opening of the book. You track the family right back.
All the sharecropping, the moonshining, the circumstances that that the white majority put African Americans in, not just slavery, but after slavery, the subsistence farming and the sharecropping, and I mean, just a rigged game, just ridiculous. All of that is there. But I was telling this detailed family story, and I just didn't see a way around either. It was almost like, include this, never hype it, include it. But if you're not going to include it, then don't do the project. Because this is a look at the factors that made Michael Jordan's world. And I'm sure there are people who'll be critical of it. Some days I am. And I'm sure there's some people who say, well, yeah, no, that's information that's important in understanding it. And some days I feel that way. So However people want to feel about it, it is what it is.
Yeah, agree. So let's take a slightly different route now. Then let's do some quick listener questions. First one from Robert Justin. After spending so much time with that Bulls team and being around elite sports for 30 plus years, where do you stand on? You're going to like this one because it's comparing eras. Kobe, Shaq, three-peat Lakers, the 73-9 Warriors versus the Jordan Bulls, either three-peat teams. Who for you wins out of those three? Put them in any era. Do whatever you want with it.
Well, first of all, this gets into a long discussion because basketball, essentially Jordan and Phil and Tex and Scotty, those two three-peat teams were reconfigured with the Lakers with Shaq and Kobe for the first three-peat, and then Kobe and Pau Gasol led the team to two more championships. And they were essentially operating under a fair and open system. What has happened to basketball is that, and I guess out of a need to, basketball has always wanted to hype scoring. That's how they sold tickets. Whether it was Jumpin' Joe Fulks with Philadelphia back in the 40s, he averaged 20 points a game, and it was hard to sell tickets, but they wanted to see a big score. And Wilt Chamberlain, the Philadelphia Warriors left him in for every minute of the season except 4, so they could average all these points, and that drove the hype over him. And obviously the NBA chose, first they cut the timeline from 10 to 8 seconds, which meant that system offenses like the triangle didn't really have time to do what they do because they have a 2-guard front, and they have some lag time with one of the guards and with the whole process and setting up. And then it's what they do in the half court. And it's sort of like San Antonio. They run their half court like a fast break. They whiz through, they used to. But the other thing that really hurt is that on an offensive rebound, it used to be a 24-second reset of the clock. And they took that to 14, which meant you couldn't. It became increasingly harder. Triangle teams couldn't reconfigure their triangles. You know how the triangle switches. It's basically 3 triangles, and they flip sides of the floor and attack. And they create the strong side, and they'll put Jordan or Kobe on the weak side, then flip the floor again. And it's an elaborate system, and it was beautiful to watch and very disciplined, but nobody could beat it. Now, a lot of other teams tried and couldn't even operate it, but the NBA Rules Committee essentially changed the rules, which changed rules of basketball all over the globe. Got rid largely of post play, put tremendous emphasis on the 3-point shot, but they really pushed the pace of the game. And so it's a very different game today. You can't play the way Jordan and those teams played in today's rules. They wouldn't be able to play. Derek Fisher tried it in New York. Phil wanted him to run the triangle, but Derek Fisher was trying to compromise because you had to push that ball up. You had to play the new pace. And it was really Mike D'Antoni's vision of the game. And my problem with that, Mike D'Antoni's a wonderful guy and a very brilliant offensive coach, but he's never won anything. And it was almost like basketball was so tired, they wanted to make sure the triangle couldn't compete. And my thing is, I think it's wonderful coaches want to push the pace, but I don't think you should artificially change the rules so that a coach can approach the game with another pace that would suit. Plus, well, the team that dominated, the Warriors, runs vestiges of the triangle offense and the San Antonio offense. However, they can't run either in any elaborate situation because the time doesn't allow it. And this was revealed to me by Tim Cone, the great triangle coach out of the Philippines, who learned Phil and Tex's system. Tex, was just astounded. And Tim Cohn's won 22 championships with the triangle in the Philippines. He had to ditch the triangle because the NBA's rules have infected basketball all over the world. It's not just other pro leagues. It's in the university play. It's in the youth league play. And I'm not saying that you need to get rid of the pace. That's fine. But that should be your choice. You shouldn't have that legislated because there's already a 24-second clock. It's not like anybody's going into stall ball. But the point, Tex Winter's point, two things about the triangle. Obviously, it's a great offense for setting up your defense because you have the floor balance. You have players back, ready to get back. But the other thing is it involves all this team play. And the new rules have given us a lot of one-on-one ugly basketball. Now, there's some beautiful demonstrations of team play in today's rules, but not many. We see not everybody is the Golden State Warriors. Not everybody has all those beautiful shooters. We have a lot of guys just dribbling the clock out. And, if I had to watch James Harden do that again in Houston, I just couldn't follow basketball. And I mean, he's a wonderful player, but to reduce this wonderful game to cut the heart of team play out of it because you want to rush the clock so that there's all this huge scoring binge and everybody goes, ooh wee, look, they scored 50. Oh, ooh wee. Well, the pace is pushed where somebody's got to be taking shots. They want the scoring to be up there. They are artificially creating this phenomenon, and it has fans the world over thinking, oh, we've hit the new age. This is evolution. That's just a bunch of suits with the NBA marketing in mind that have stepped the pace up. And so I don't know. I would love to see the Warriors, coached by Steve Kerr, with Durant, if I had a time machine, go against the best of both of those other two teams. And I would love to see that under a 24-second clock so that the teams of the Bulls and Lakers could run their offense. If we were able to fly them to today through a time machine, and they got out in the prime of their lives to play those games and had to play them under today's rules, they couldn't run the triangle. Now, they still might. I don't know. But I think it would be a fascinating game to see with a 24-second clock those teams play, because the Warriors have the kind of players that are going to be good in any era. Now, they're not a great rebounding team, so how would they stop Dennis Rodman from controlling all his offensive rebounds? I don't know. And, we'd have to – I apologize for the phone in the background.
That's all right.
How would you handle all the matchups? That would be fun. But until we get some sanity back in the rules and some honesty and just go with a 24-second clock and a 10-second timeline. Now, they also call the game differently today. There's no hand checking, all that stuff Jordan went through. You know what? I don't think that's terrible to enforce that. I just think they let people get fouled in the post too much on offense. And, it's a very cynical thing in a lot of ways. They're saying we've got to dumb down the game because we don't believe today's players can do it or today's coaches can coach it. Well, if they can't, then they'll do a push game or something else. I don't want people to have to do system offenses. I don't want them to have to play at that pace. I just don't want them to outlaw it if they choose to. Mm-hmm. I think it makes the game interesting, and it allows for a true evolution rather than a lie, a ginned up game that's done, and it's made the NBA lots of money. So
I knew you'd like that question. I follow you on Twitter. Obviously, we talk fairly frequently, and I've seen your reactions to some threads like that. What are the three most underrated traits, factors, or elements that a team needs to be successful in your opinion?
Floor balance, ability to get back and defend. So transition defense. The triangle provides two of those. And I think it's four things. I think you need some pretty skilled offensive players, and you need some really good selfless role players. Those four things.
Yeah, I think it's as simple as that. A question from Josh. What was the worst or most risque question you heard a reporter ask Michael?
Well, Michael was really good with the press. I didn't hear people ask him a lot of stupid stuff. Michael intimidated that entire league. Now, he was a nice person with reporters. He saved my life. I almost walked backwards in the playoffs in Charlotte on a practice day. Michael was walking out, and a group of reporters, we were all talking to him as he walked out. And I was leading the group with my recorder there. And I was this far from walking off the big loading dock and falling 12 feet onto concrete below. At the last minute, he reached out and grabbed me and kept me doing that. He was good with reporters. There would be people who didn't understand things. I've done my own turn at that. None of us we're reporters. We're not gods flying around with capes. We're not all knowing. And so I've asked some of the dumbest questions in the history of basketball, and I work hard at it. So, I don't know. I know I've asked some dumb questions. I don't think I've asked MJ any dumb. I worked hard to be ready for those MJ things.
And we've got a couple of Rodman questions to finish. So Tom David asks, obviously in The Last Dance, we got to see Rodman's excursions to Vegas and his dalliance with the WCW. How much of a distraction to the team was he? And did he disappear more often than this? It just wasn't as big a news.
Well, they won 3 championships with him. He was a big factor there. But Dennis's life had fallen apart. I spent a lot of time in the San Antonio Spurs camp when he was down there, and it was not a pretty sight. He was fond of going to Vegas and shooting these $50,000 craps rolls, and he just would lose mountains of money. And so he went to Chicago bankrupt. He had burned out all his bridges and options just about in the league. He had run through all his money. And he gets up there, and Chicago goes nuts over him. He's got all the crazy stuff he does. He's, the wedding dress, marries himself. He makes $15 million off the floor in endorsements that helps replenish his. But Dennis had some issues. He's a good guy. I used to do a lot of Pistons work, so I knew him back when he was just a young kid, being who he was in the NBA. And Michael kept Dennis in line. Everybody says Phil did it. Well, Phil was an open-minded guy who was tolerant and had a sense of humor about it, but Michael was the fierce one. And it's like Steve Kerr put it. He told me, he said, for Michael Jordan, the life, Steve said, Dennis was always submissive to Michael. And you could see that. Now, he would do his things, but nobody conditioned more. Nobody studied more tape. Nobody worked harder at the mental side of the game. He was very close with Tex Winter. They would work for hours. Tex loved him, and he loved Tex. And I just don't think it was that big a problem. It makes for nice copy, and you got to have some craziness to. Rodman was fun. Bill Smith, the team photographer, would go everywhere with Rodman. And all over Chicago and all the bars, all the women were in a contest to show him their breasts. And Bill Smith had books of photos of women exposing their breasts in Chicago bars to Dennis Rodman. So There. That's how crazy it is.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy. Final question then. The only thing that was not perfect about this series was that they didn't really show how key Rodman was to winning that 98 championship. This is from Nick Hubble. I remember him and Karl Malone going at it the whole series and Dennis doing all the dirty work. Do you think the contribution of role players on those title teams was fairly represented in The Last Dance?
Well, I think you saw Steve Kerr hitting those shots, but they really didn't put a lot of time. I mean, they did the little thing on Tex and the triangle, and it was sort of a joke. There's been always a raging debate. The people who got their butts drubbed by Jordan in the triangle, those coaches are bitter guys. That's why the rules were changed and part of it. And they would always say, oh, anybody could have won with Michael. Well, they had a bunch of people have their shot at winning with Michael, and they didn't get close. Anyone could have won with Shaq and Kobe, but they didn't get close. It's when that disciplined offense, and believe me, it's not the offense first. It's the players first. You've got to have that special talent. So it's a false argument. But the truth is that the triangle offense made for disciplined team play as opposed to the style of one-on-one that the NBA had evolved to a really ugly style of it, the ISO offenses. And today, I think it's evolved to an ugly style of little team play. Now, you'll see some beautiful team play. When the ball does move, it'll whip, but there's not it's different. It's still not what basketball can be with a 24-second clock. And no jimmying of the other time elements. And so, I think that despite all the arguments, it worked beautifully. It incorporated the role players all had a piece of it. They really didn't have the time to tell that story because if they stopped, it's like Jason Harris said. Well, I had asked him about something, really the shoes and Nike and Sonny Vaccaro, because all of that is revisionist history. And Sonny Vaccaro was the champion of Jordan as the guy for Nike. And I had the people at the meeting, and as Jason said, we contacted Billy Packer, who was there when Sonny began pitching it to Phil Knight, and Phil Knight wasn't interested during the '84 Olympics. But he said, ultimately, we had to move on. And so there were things that really don't fit the new world they've created. So they just chose to eliminate them. They didn't get into George Mumford and the mindfulness, which was a huge thing. That was where Jordan, all talking about being in the moment, all of that was the training of George Mumford. They really didn't, you didn't get the sense of being at a Bulls game in the 90s and just how that team played. And I mean, you'd get little clips of people scoring baskets and stuff. And they did a little better job of it with Kerr hitting those shots. But you really, and I'm not sure how they could have done it. I'm not a filmmaker. But there are those kinds of things that really just, the narrative has ended on all those things. The NBA has taken this different path. And so this was a flashback that didn't lead to questions on those items. It answered a lot of questions. It was a brilliant piece of filmmaking. But there are certain questions that weren't politically correct. And so, or even easy to address. And that included role players, the triangle, team play, those kinds of things.
I think that's fantastic. Roland, thank you very, very much for your time.
Thank you.
And I'm so glad I've had the chance to do this with you 3 times now. It's just always fascinating, new stories, unparalleled level of insight. If people want to follow you, you're on Instagram at RL Lazenby and on Twitter at Lazenby. Is that right?
At Lazenby, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't get on Instagram much. I'm not the greatest technology wizard. So, but I do manage to get on Twitter and make a fool of myself. So if you're bored and you want to see some old man make a fool of himself, you can follow me on Twitter.
And your new book on Magic Johnson is out when?
That'll be out if I can drop Last Dance and everything else that's happened this year. I'm sitting here, you can't see it, but I got a mountain of research around me. That book should come out in the fall of 2021.
Awesome. That's one to look forward to. And as soon as that drops, I'm sure we'll have you back on to talk specifically Magic Johnson that time. But again, thank you very, very much for everyone who's listening. If you're not already, please subscribe to the podcast, rate and review us, and follow us on all social media at Double Clutch UK. Thank you very much for listening and watching, and we'll catch you again next time.
See ya.